Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I'm continuing the coverage of the new unique items added in patch 3.26, with what is likely the single strongest new unique that was added, especially at the budget range right now. As I make this video, the cheapest copies of this unique listed on trade are 5C a pop, which is absolutely ridiculous value. Even if this unique was 500C, it would still be incredibly good at that price. And we are of course talking about Coiling Whisper, which is a new unique ring. This item drops exclusively from one of the new pinnacle bosses added in this expansion, the Incarnation of Fear, and it drops from a pool of exclusive uniques on that boss, and whilst we don't have the concrete data for drop rates just yet, trade site listings would appear to suggest around a 40% drop rate on this one, so it's very common if you're farming this boss. So let's get straight into it. Beginning with the fact that Coiling Whisper is an amethyst ring, which means it has chaos resistance for its implicit modifier. Now, unlike the Whispers of Infinity Amulet I covered in my last video, this implicit is going to be a lot more useful on many of the builds that want to make use of this ring. However, with that said, with the emergence of Whispers of Infinity and the Chaos Inoculation Forbidden Rite build beginning to become very popular this league, this implicit isn't all that useful on that build as they're already immune to chaos damage. And that's where the high drop rate comes into play, because this ring becomes a great target for double corruptions in the Temple of Asenath. Rings can obtain some great corrupted implicits, including aura effect and increased attributes, or even bleed, poison, or ignite immunity. Okay, so what about the unique modifiers on this ring? Firstly, we have 25 to 50% reduced area effect of hex skills. So this is going to significantly lower the area that a hex curse covers when it's cast, and it will also lower the area effects of any hexes you have reserved as auras via blasphemy. However, if you're using curse on hit from a ring modifier for example, you'll avoid any downside imposed by this modifier. Next we have a very impactful modifier to any build. Targets are unaffected by your hexes. So this is a really big one. This renders your hex curse essentially useless against enemies in regards to their normal purpose. For example, elemental weakness will no longer lower monster resistances, or vulnerability will no longer make monsters take increased physical damage. That's a big loss for the majority of builds. But this is a league where you can gain a mercenary, and you can equip that mercenary with extra curses and have them apply curses for you to make up for this loss. However, even though targets are unaffected by your hex curses, those curses can still be applied to monsters, and they still persist just like they normally would, only they now have no effects other than existing as a debuff on the monster, and that's important for the next modifier on this unique. But before we get there, there's another important mention here. This modifier only applies to hex curses specifically, it doesn't apply to mark curses, and that means that given that you have enough curse limit, you can still fully benefit from a mark skill applied to the target. So for example, you can anoint Whispers of Doom, or on the Occultist Ascendancy you could take Unholy Authority if you wanted to be able to apply an additional curse. And that way you can make use of the Hex Curse to benefit from the next modifier on this ring, which we'll get to in a moment, and you can still make use of a Mark Curse to its full effect. Okay, now we have the most important modifier on this unique ring, and this is the reason why you're going to be using this item. When 90% of your hex's duration expires on an enemy, eat 1 soul per enemy power. So first of all, eat 1 soul per enemy power is referring to Soul Eater, which is a buff. Soul Eater provides 5% increased attack speed, 5% increased cast speed, and 1% increased character size per soul, up to a maximum of 45 souls. And souls are lost at a rate of 1 every half a second if you haven't eaten a soul in the past 4 seconds. So at the cap of 45 souls, you'll have a ridiculous 225% increased attack speed, 225% increased cast speed, and 45% increased character size. That is insane. To put that into perspective, a normal ring can roll up to 7% increased attack speed and up to 16% increased cast speed. Yes, you are sacrificing your curse for this buff, but for almost every build, this is a ridiculously disproportionate trade-off. You are gaining so much more from a maximum effect Soul Eater buff than you would be gaining from your curse. And the crazy thing about this Soul Eater buff that's gained from Coiling Whisper is how it's gained. So you gain 1 stack of Soul Eater per enemy power when your applied Hex Curse duration is 90% expired. A normal Hex Curse has a duration of between 8 and 12 seconds depending on the gem level, with the exception of Temporal Chains which last for 5 seconds at level 1 up to about 9 seconds at level 20. Now, applying a Hex normally to a pack of monsters isn't going to work out, because the Hex will last too long and they'll die before 90% of its duration has expired. But there are a few ways to get around this. The first option is Asenath's Gentle Touch. These unique gloves come built in with Curse on Hit Temporal Chains, but most importantly, it has the modifier, non-aura curses you inflict are not removed from dying enemies, which means that even though you'll quickly kill packs of monsters, the temporal chains inflicted by hitting them will remain on the corpse, ticking down, and once 90% of the duration has expired, you'll receive Soul Eater stacks. Now let's quickly discuss enemy power, since Coiling Whisper provides Soul Eater stacks with the actual amount gained based on the power of the enemy that the curse is expiring on. Enemy power is a mechanic originally tied to Warcry, which has slowly been branching out into other systems. So normal or white monsters have 1 power, magic or blue monsters have 2 power, rare or yellow monsters have 10 power, and unique boss monsters have 20 power. That means that, for example, an expiring Hex Curse on a rare monster would grant you 10 Soul Eater stacks. Okay, so we've just discussed Asenath's and how that item is a great solution for mapping. You'll be able to consistently keep up a max stack Soul Eater buff, so you can just boost through maps. But what about bossing? Well, this is where an old friend comes into play. Hex Touch Support. This is a support gem that used to be very popular, but hasn't been particularly useful ever since its nerf in patch 3.20. But this nerf added 2 things. Less effect of applied Hex Curses, which is something we don't care about because our Hexes already don't affect the target due to the modifier on Coiled Whisper. Then the other nerf was reduced curse duration, something which we can turn into an upside with this unique ring. So, a level 1 Hex Touch support has 50% reduced curse duration, and make sure you don't level it up or apply quality as that will make the curse last longer. This means that with just level 1 Temporal Chains and level 1 Hex Touch together, Temporal Chains goes from a 5-second base duration to just 2.5 seconds. Add in less duration support at level 20 with 20% quality, and this goes down even further to a duration of just over 1 second. You could even spec into reduced skill effect duration if you wanted to, but I think that's going to be overkill for most setups. However, if you find you're applying your Hex too frequently with your setup, you could consider reduced skill effect duration because that stacks additively with the 50% reduced duration from Hex Touch, so it's very potent to lower the duration even further. So from there, you have a 3-link, and now you need a skill to actually apply the curse with and round this out as your 4-link that's used to gain Soul Eater stacks. There's a couple of ways you could go about this. You could simply just use a skill that you want to use every 3 seconds or so to maintain stacks. Ideally, this is a low cast time skill if it's a spell, so that you can spend the least time possible using it to keep your stacks up. Now on a bow build, you could use Manaforged Arrows, but to do this you need a 5-link instead of a 4-link. You also need to balance out your mana cost so that the triggered attack does not overwrite the Hex before 90% of the duration has expired. However, if you can get it to work, this is a fully automated setup to gain Soul Eater stacks, which is incredibly powerful. And it will likely work for mapping too, assuming you don't have ridiculous amounts of damage and everything doesn't just instantly fall over. For melee builds, you could consider Infernal Cry, but I'm not the biggest fan of this option because if your attack speed is too high, you can easily overwrite the Hex, and your attack speed will likely be too high due to Soul Eater. There's also the new Bladefall of Trarthus gem, which may be an option here as a Hex applicator if you have enough mana recovery to sustain it. But once again, you need to ensure the hit timing and the Hex duration is just right. Bladefall of Trarthus also notably has quite a low range from your character. But I think my favourite option for bossing specifically is Orb of Storms, which creates an orb that will strike nearby enemies once per interval. The orb doesn't expire until it hits a number of times, so it's exceptionally good for more stationary bosses. Be aware that the base hit interval scales with cast speed, but a level 1 Orb of Storms will hit once every 3.5 seconds, or about 0.29 hits per second. And with 225% increased cast speed, the hit interval is increased to about 0.93 hits per second, so you'll be able to reapply hexes very soon after they've expired to quickly gain Soul Eater stacks. However, you must take note of your cast speed, as you can end up with too much cast speed and the interval may end up reapplying the curse before 90% has expired. Be aware that Orb of Storms will perform additional strikes if you cast a lightning skill in its area, so you want to avoid that. And once you have your setup, you're good to go. You now have a ridiculous amount of attack and cast speed gained from a ring slot and a skill link or a glove setup, which is more than worth it for that amount of investment. But beyond that, you can push this even further. Wilma's Requital is a unique helmet that makes increases and reductions to cast speed apply to attack speed, whilst also granting Ancestral Bond. Now, Ancestral Bond will provide an additional maximum totem, but it will prevent you from dealing damage yourself, so this will be a totem build. But Soul Eater's buff provides increased attack and cast speed, and notably, these modifiers are separate, unlike some similar modifiers that appear on one line and do not double dip with Wilma's. And that means you'll be getting a ridiculous 450% increased attack speed with max Soul Eater stacks. That is just insane. You can combine this with Ballista Totems, and of course they will just be going crazy. Or you could make use of Dawnstrider, which is now the only source of melee totems in Path of Exile, and you can play a melee slam totem build if you wanted to. Now, I will say that I do feel a bit bad for Zizaran. If you don't know, he helped design the Soul Ascension gloves which drop from Uber Elder, but these gloves are just completely outclassed by Coiling Whisper in almost every way. So if this ring does stick around, hopefully he gets to redesign them or do something with them in the future. But that's it. Easily the most broken new unique in this patch, especially given how common and therefore how cheap it is. I expect this will be an Ashes of the Stars type deal, where it's a common item in the patch when it's first introduced, and then the next patch is made to be much rarer. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a 1 or 2% drop unique next patch, so make sure you enjoy it while it's easily accessible. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.